I would say that evil grows, first of all, in the darkness. And that sometimes that's the literal dark of shadows and night time and, I don't know, windowless rooms. But it's also the darkness of ignorance. And you might say the darkness of forgetting. But to be honest, that's to put a positive spin on it that I'm not sure it deserves. What just happened in the Canadian Parliament was that a 98-year-old man called Jaroslav Hunka, a man who fought for the Waffen-SS, the most feared and evil part of the Nazi war machine. He fought for the Nazis, and therefore against the Allies, meaning against Canada, against the United States of America, against Britain, against France, the whole lot during World War II. But Hunka was introduced as a soldier and as a hero who had fought against the Russians. He was to be celebrated for having fought the Russians in World War II. We fought alongside the Russians in World War II, as did Canada and the United States of America and all the Allies, the Allied powers. Canada took a disproportionately heavy hit in World War II. Thousands and thousands of her soldiers were killed fighting Nazis on the beach at Juno, the Normandy beach that was the objective of the Canadian element of the landings on Normandy. And they came up against the Waffen-SS, which was in part why they took such a terrible hit on that day and many days thereafter. And in terms of per head of population, Canada was among the most hurt by the war, the most hurt by fighting Nazis. But there, in that parliament, Hunka was given a standing ovation in front of the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, in front of the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, who saluted Hunka with an upraised fist. And he was given that ovation by the entire parliament, to a man, to a woman, government and opposition. You watch it open-mouthed, really. And Trudeau, for whom I lack the words adequately to describe his despicable nature, Trudeau has said it was, quote, extremely upsetting. And he has, well, let's say, allowed the Speaker of the House, Anthony Rota, to take the blame. As though it was all down to him. As though that which happens in front of the entire House of Commons in the Canadian Parliament isn't checked with the Prime Minister's office. That nothing moves in that space without the Prime Minister and his office being forewarned of it and having to give it the okay. But Trudeau has said, I mean, it's unbelievable. He has said it was embarrassing for all Canadians, thereby somehow spreading the blame to every citizen of his country, including, obviously, descendants of veterans of the war who bled and died fighting Nazis. And their Prime Minister is inviting them now to share the blame for the celebration and standing ovation that was given to a Nazi in that place. Trudeau even had the gall, to note that it happened on the eve of Yom Kippur, which is in the Jewish calendar, it's the holiest of holy days. There is no day that means more in the Jewish calendar than Yom Kippur. And you wonder, surely that's a 1 in 365 chance that such an abhorrence would happen on the eve of Yom Kippur. And then somehow Trudeau segued into the need to fight Russian propaganda and misinformation. He didn't even draw breath. You know, was he implying that the SS nonagenarian, a literal Nazi, was given a standing ovation by the entire Canadian Parliament as a consequence of Russian propaganda? I mean, how exactly are the Russians supposed to be implicated in the events that unfolded in that place on that day. The point is about, at best, ignorance. Is it possible that all those parliamentarians had forgotten or somehow never knew that Canada and the rest of the Allies were on the same side as the Russians in World War II and fighting against Nazis like Jaroslav Hunka? Is that possible? I have to ask the question, because that would appear to be what we are being expected to accept as the explanation for that tableau. And here's the thing, I mean, whoever invited the Nazi, whoever knew in advance who and what Jaroslav Hunka was and is, whoever met with him in advance of the audience in the House of Commons, and let's imagine he was met and, given a wee cup of tea and a biscuit somewhere in an antechamber before he was, trotted out into the audience. Whoever thought it's a good idea, I mean, set that aside for a moment. Let's just, that's what happened. But the fact remains that in front of all, and thereby in front of the world, that old man was held up as a hero for fighting against the Red Army in World War II. The Red Army, which, by orders of magnitude, bled more blood to defeat the Nazi war machine than anybody else, than everybody else combined. 20 odd million dead the Red Army sacrificed in order to beat the Nazis. This is a wrong of infinite proportions, what we've been invited to witness in Canada. And Trudeau should be gone as a result. He should have just fallen on his sword there and then, along with his government. And I would say that every member of the opposition who stood and clapped should be marked as unfit ever to hold office in Canada. That would be my assessment of what we've just watched. What happened that day is unforgivable and must be unforgettable as well. Make a note. But here's the rub. It appears something of the utmost importance has already been forgotten or else scrubbed from the history books. We must ask ourselves exactly what's happening, at the very least what might be happening, what might be being attempted by evil people. And there are always evil people, sometimes waiting in the dark and sometimes in plain view. Now, George Orwell and his novel 1984 are invoked almost daily now, but I make no apology for joining in because it's for good reason. I've wondered, seriously, if in fact his time spent on the island of Jura, an island in the Scottish Hebrides, where he wrote the novel, I've wondered if that time he spent on Jura saw him gifted with the second sight that they talk about in those parts. It's the Celtic Scottish idea that it's the ability, some would say the curse, of seeing the future right now in the present. In the Scottish Hebrides and in the Scottish Highlands, they call that ability or that curse or that blessing, depending on your point of view, they call it the second sight. Among much else, in 1984, Orwell wrote about the rewriting of history by those who are determined to take control of the present and the future. As I'm sure, I don't know how many folk have actually read 1984, but we did it at school. I've read it since, and in the world of 1984 there are three countries or three nations: Oceania, Eurasia and East Asia. And a state of forever war exists between these nations. Sometimes Oceania is at war with Eurasia, and in a kind of existing in an uneasy peace with East Asia. But at other times, Oceania is at war with East Asia. But it doesn't matter, not in any meaningful sense. What matters is that there's a forever war. And the forever war is necessary because it consumes all the things that are being made in the factories by the hapless, helpless, submissive, brainwashed proles. That's how it works. And the novel is about the protagonist of the novel is Winston Smith, who works in the Ministry of Truth, so-called, and the Ministry of Truth exists to make sure history is continuously rewritten to suit the present. So whichever country Oceania is at war with now is portrayed as the country it has always been at war with. That's the trick. And to quote from the book, actually, as Winston well knew, it was only 4 years since Oceania had been at war with East Asia and in alliance with Eurasia. But that was merely a piece of furtive knowledge which he happened to possess because his memory was not satisfactorily under control. Officially, the change of partners had never happened. Oceania was at war with Eurasia. Therefore, Oceania had always been at war with Eurasia. The enemy of the moment always represented absolute evil, and it followed that any past or future agreement with him was impossible. Who controls the past, ran the party slogan, controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And yet the past, though of its nature alterable, never had been altered. Whatever was true now was true from everlasting to everlasting. It was quite simple. All that was needed was an unending series of victories over your own memory. Reality control, they called it. In newspeak, doublethink. Now, is that what we're seeing now? In Canada first, but soon elsewhere, and then everywhere. Since the West is at war with Russia now, and the West is at war with Russia now in all but name, must history be rewritten to show that we've always been at war with Russia? In the manner of 1984. And, I mean, more sinister yet, are we actually being invited to rethink the role of the Nazis? I mean, after all, from the start of the war in Ukraine, some were pointing out that the Ukrainian regime was riven with Nazis. But such observations, references to the Nazi Azov battalion within the Ukrainian army, when people pointed that out, they were furiously shouted down. How dare you? And I remember, I'm not going to name names, but commentators here in Britain lined up on air to say they didn't care about the politics of the Ukrainian fighters as long as they were killing Russians. Yeah, whatever. So what if they're Nazis? As long as they're killing Russians. And if you called that out at the time, you were a baddie. So, I would just remember the words of George Orwell. Like a prophet, he is to be listened to. I quote him again. Then the lie passed into history and became truth. Who controls the past, ran the party slogan, controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And yet the past, though of its nature alterable, never had been altered. Whatever was true now was true from everlasting to everlasting. It was quite simple. All that was needed was an unending series of victories over your own memory. I say these are dangerous days. And as it turns out, Big Brother really is watching.